And likewise, that's a really nice thing to say. I really kind of want to be around Caitlin too, so it's really fun. And what I love about events like these is that it's a whole room full of people that I really want to be around and to learn from and to absorb your wisdom and your knowledge. So I'm hoping that what I can share today is just a small catalyst. That's the word I picked. I hope to be a catalyst for helping you find a place to start if you haven't started along this journey yet. And just a little bit about me and my business. I am based in Northern California. My consulting company specializes in helping companies through the B Corp certification process. I've had the pleasure of working with companies of all different sizes and all different industries, and I love the cross-pollination of ideas. And so I am here to learn even more than I am here to share, but I hope to share something of value as well. So a little bit about where we're going during this session. Caitlin already outlined it very well. We're going to make the business case for 3 specific quick impact assessment metrics, review some case studies around each one of them to give you some ideas and fuel to burn later on. You're going to be able to choose one metric for improvement within your own organization. And then we're going to break into some action planning groups, and you'll be receiving some tools to help facilitate that process. But first, a little bit of context setting. How many of you believe that in your roles and in your companies, you have the ability to profoundly and positively impact the quality of life of other individuals? That is 100%. That is pretty awesome. See why I love being in rooms like this? Moving out in our ripples, how many of you feel that you have the ability to significantly impact the effectiveness of your organizations? Awesome. And finally, how many of you feel that your organizations and you and your roles in particular have the ability to impact the ecosystems in which your companies operate? Room full of systems thinkers. I love it. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a metric that addresses each one of these layers, the individual level, the organizational level, and the ecosystem level. And my belief is that no matter which action you choose to pursue, it does have ripple effects throughout all the layers, the ecosystem, the individual, the organization. So it doesn't really matter where you start. I echo Rob, do something, start small, pick something that resonates with you and that you feel like you will have an impact with, and just by its very nature, you will be having an impact throughout your whole ecosystem. So starting with that individual level, the quick impact assessment metric that you're probably familiar with is what % of your employees are engaged or satisfied? How many of you in the room have done an employee engagement survey? A lot, not 100%. If you choose to pursue this one, you will walk out of the room today with a very specific way to do so. But just a definition first. What is employee engagement? And we're going to talk about why it matters. Employee engagement represents the levels of enthusiasm and connection that your employees feel with your organization. It's an indicator of how motivated people are to go that extra mile and of how committed they are to staying in your organization. So a whole bunch of statistics here. This is a very rich field of research. Why does employee engagement matter? Why is this work important? And for those of you in the back of the room who cannot read this, companies that experience a very high level of employee engagement compared to companies with lower levels of employee engagement, they experience a 41% reduction in absenteeism. They have a 24% lower turnover rate. Is turnover kind of expensive? 40% reduction in quality defects. Employees are 17% higher in their productivity. There's a 20% increase in sales just if you have a very engaged workforce. 21% higher profitability. 10% higher customer scores, And get this one, a 70% decrease in employee safety incidents in the workplace. Any one of these metrics would be strong enough reason to build an engaged workforce, but taken together, I think this is a pretty powerful case for why you want to invest in your people and invest in people feeling connected and satisfied. And we've heard a little bit about the millennials. Caitlin was just talking about how this new generation coming into the workforce now really wants to have that connection to purpose. This is really a driver, a key driver. And these purpose-oriented employees are 54% more likely to stay for 5 or more years, 30% more likely to be high performers. And on this employee net promoter score scale, has anyone been familiar with this? It's a scale of 1 to 10. How likely are you to recommend our workplace to a friend or colleague? People who rank that response in this 9 to 10 range, those are considered your promoters. That's what you want your workforce to be, and purpose-oriented individuals are much more likely to be at that end of the scale. And I should say, too, that statistically, I think it's something like less than a third of the workforce in the US is considered engaged in their work. So that's over 2/3 of our workforces that are actively disengaged with what we're doing. Go back to those stats on profit, sales, customer satisfaction. It matters. So how to measure employee engagement, the how-to comes after this part. But some of the things that are important to include in your measurement, in addition to that net promoter score, would be overall satisfaction, employees' sense of connection to the larger purpose of your company and the impacts you're having in the world. And finally, speaking to that inclusion piece that Rob spoke so well about, that sense of belonging, that I can bring my full self to work and I can contribute the skills and the knowledge and the experience that I have, and that it will be sought and that it matters. So the how-to comes later. I'm going to skip over that part and go right to what do you do with the results once you have them? Because these are questions that you don't necessarily want to be asking unless you're prepared to act on the responses. Transparency is key. Once you've done an employee satisfaction survey, it's really important to report the results out to your employees in a very transparent way. This is one way that I've used with clients where we present the answers that are given in a dashboard format. So the questions are all ranked on a scale of 1 to 5. So anything that's between a 4 and a 5 is considered green. You're doing really well there. There's really little room for improvement. Scores between a 3 and a 4, those are yellow. You know, we could be doing better. We want to be doing better. And anything that falls below a 3 is red. And so that's a hot spot. And so when you look at all the scores together for your survey, you and your employees can see very transparently which are your items that you might want to start prioritizing. This can be a really great planning tool because it gives you quantified data to work from. You're not just guessing, and you're able to see what's important to your employees and develop ways, hopefully inclusively with a lot of input to these ideas, for how to improve in those hot spots. And then best practice being when you repeat employee engagement surveys either every year or every other year, you begin to build a data set where you can see if the initiatives that resulted from these results are having the impact that you want. So with one client of mine, we've done 3 consecutive surveys, and so we're starting to be able to trend the data. And this is the Trendline Chart that we put together. And the colors correspond. Scores between 4 and a 5 are in the green, between a 3 and a 4 you're in the yellow, and sometimes things fall in the red. We have a hot spot. So this particular metric, for those in the back who can't read it, in the last 7 days, I have received recognition or praise for doing good work. This company had some improvement to do. And you can see over time how they have achieved that improvement. Each of these 3 lines, again, because this font is super small for you in the back, all locations combined, and then they had 2 separate locations that were, the data sets were collected separately. And over time, again, you can start to see what's trending and how you're doing internally in terms of employee engagement and satisfaction. I'm sure there will be time for questions, and I know that we're just doing a very brief touch on 3 topics that could be all-day topics in and of themselves. So I'm just going to keep breezing along. And just know that during the action planning phase of this workshop, you will be provided with a tool and be able to develop an action plan if this is the metric that you choose to try to move the needle on. So speeding right along, you with me?
Yes.
All right. We're moving into the organizational level of that model. What % of management roles are filled by women and or underrepresented populations? Diversity and inclusion. This is a very hot topic, very prevalent in business blogs and writing. There's a growing body of research around this work as well. And so what I'm planning to do during this little section of this workshop is to kind of level set and create a shared language around some of this, because this can be difficult territory. These can be difficult conversations, but there are ways to approach this topic that start where you are and start building. So, definitions. Women and people who identify as women are one underrepresented group in leadership, but other populations with barriers to employment or who tend not to be pulled into leadership positions as often cover a full gamut of factors. Could have socioeconomic backgrounds from low or very poor communities, low income or very poor communities. Could be around physical or mental disabilities, previous homelessness, previously incarcerated, alcohol or drug dependency, and then this whole list of chronically discriminated against populations based on gender, race, color, disability, political opinion, sexual orientation, age, religion, social or ethnic origin, and so on. So why does this matter? Making the business case for diversity and inclusion, and it's important that these 2 things go together, diversity and inclusion, they are separate. Employees report in organizations that have greater levels of diversity in the workforce, they have a greater intent to stay in the company. Their ideas are more likely to be developed. They're more likely to see their innovations implemented. There's more collaboration among teams, and there's a greater team commitment. So that's at the employee level and their experience of working in a more diverse workforce. This metric is looking particularly at diversity in leadership positions. So what are the benefits of having diverse leadership in your organization? Organizations with greater gender diversity tend to be 15% more likely to have better than median returns. If there's high levels of racial and ethnic diversity, 35% more likely to have better than median returns. Having diverse leadership teams demonstrates a path for other folks from these underrepresented populations, that there's a path for growth and advancement within the company. And then market share-wise, companies with diverse leadership are 45% more likely to improve their market share and 70% more likely to capture new market share. I think that's probably because your ability to communicate with different audiences increases the more diversity that you have. So definitions. The simplest definition that I've found for diversity, it's all of the ways that we are similar and different. And diversity, importantly, is about a collective. It's in relation to others. A single individual cannot be diverse. So you cannot have a diverse candidate for a job. You can have a diverse candidate pool, but a single individual cannot be diverse. Inclusion. It's really important to note that if you bring diversity to the table, Inclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Inclusion is a separate, it takes intentionality, it takes focus. And what is inclusion? The simplest definition that I found is it's a sense of belonging and purpose for all. Equity. Everyone gets what they need to be successful. We don't all start from the same starting point, and so we might need to provide different resources for different folks to have the same chance of success within our organization. I don't know how many of you have seen this graphic before. I really like it. Equality does not always equal equality. So in this first image, we've got all three people get an equal box to stand on to see the ball game. But you can see that solution doesn't work for everybody. Equity is where the resources are allocated so that everyone has that successful outcome. And the third image there talks about removing structural barriers to equity in the first place. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. And again, this is just a very quick overview of a very deep topic. The other important concept for us to acknowledge and that needs to be part of these conversations is unconscious bias. We all have it, every single one of us. Unconscious bias is learned stereotypes that are so ingrained in us that they are automatic and they are unintentional. They influence our behavior. And it's important to note in the context of this metric that unconscious bias plays into as much as 40% of hiring decisions. And to kind of illustrate this, I wanted to share 3 examples of what happens when people are in search of a job. The research shows that 2 in the pool. This is a concept that was new to me when I was putting this presentation together. Women and people of color have a greater chance of being hired when there are 2 candidates in the final candidate pool that share that demographic, basically. So for women, you're 79 times more likely to hire a woman into a position if there are 2 women in the candidate pool. And for people of color, it's 194 times more likely to hire a person of color if there are 2 in that final candidate pool. White-sounding applicant names have a 30 to 50% higher callback rate for interviews than people with Asian-sounding or African-American sounding names. So this unconscious bias plays out in our workplaces whether we're aware of it or not. And this last factoid is to bring emphasis on your written job descriptions. How your job description is written really matters. We like to put long lists of must-haves and nice-to-haves in our job descriptions. But gender-wise, it's really interesting to note that the research shows that men are likely to apply for a job when they meet 60% or more of the listed criteria. Women won't apply unless they meet 100% of the criteria. So if we create these big, complex job descriptions when we're posting and we're hoping to attract a diverse pool of candidates, there's a lot of research out here about languaging that is gender and also ethnically and also age biased and all kinds of things. It's a really rich treasure trove of information to look at as you're considering your job descriptions. Diversity and inclusion is hard work. Having diverse perspectives at the table, by definition, brings conflicting perspectives and different perspectives together. So there are a lot of best practices that if you are aiming towards this metric of increasing the diversity in your management teams, it's important to invest time and effort to develop a culture where you have a constructive debate of ideas. We debate ideas, not people. We carefully manage interpersonal conflict. We promote inclusiveness. It's really important to create a culture where you combat stereotypes and discriminatory behavior and create a safe environment where it's okay to call that out when unconscious bias shows up for people, to bring it into the open and have a conversation about it. And finally, managing and analyzing the effectiveness of your inclusion efforts is a best practice as well as you move into this territory. So a case study here, B-Lab, we've heard B-Lab mentioned. They are the nonprofit that created the B Corp standards, and they manage B Corp certification. They're a very forward-thinking organization. A couple years ago, they did an internal survey of diversity and inclusion, really diving deeply into this work within their own organization. And they were really surprised to learn that 96% of white employees felt that they could bring their whole selves to work, and they're motivated by this purpose-driven work, and they feel great about being there, compared to only 57% of their staff who are people of color felt the same way. And as they dug into this work, and they've made this work very transparent, there's some beautifully written articles by J. Cohen Gilbert and Forbes.com magazine and things like that. Their offices are located in a white, affluent suburb. People of color didn't necessarily feel welcome in that neighborhood, and it wasn't a comfortable experience for them to show up to work every day. They also tended to hire from within their intern pool, and when they looked at their intern program, they found that they were hiring or bringing on interns through the networks of people they knew. And the people they knew came from the same schools they came from and tended to live in the same neighborhoods they live in. And so also with an unpaid internship program, only people from certain backgrounds can afford to take an unpaid internship. So this was unintentionally creating a very homogeneous work environment. The third thing that they discovered was that even their reimbursement policy had an adverse impact on their compadres who are from less privileged backgrounds. They, for travel, required people to spend the money on a credit card, and then they would reimburse that travel. That was not possible for everybody, or it made monthly expenses management very difficult for some populations in comparison to others. So they've really looked at the gamut of their business practices to really think about how to make it the most inclusive and welcoming environment that they can, because if you remember that definition of inclusion, it's a sense of belonging and purpose for all. So how do we move the needle on this? Again, the how-to comes in the action planning part and in the tools that Melissa will share with you in a little bit. I'm just providing that fuel. With me? Yes. All right. So now we move out to that outer ring of that concentric circle model. Do you have a formal supplier code of conduct that holds your suppliers accountable for environmental and social performance? This is that ecosystem level, and Rob spoke so beautifully to this that I think that my work is done. But I'll give you a definition, and this is from the Pet Sustainability Coalition themselves. A supplier code of conduct is a set of standards that a company and its suppliers agree on to ensure that a set level of environmental and social practices are met. Sounds pretty simple. What are the benefits? Caitlin talked beautifully about risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is the number 3 priority of procurement professionals out there. Didn't know that before, now you do. It helps with a lot of things. Knowing your suppliers and holding them accountable helps you with not only legal compliance, but that transparency piece that helps meet the customer expectations and build that customer loyalty. It helps you bring into your supply chain values-aligned organizations. Where we spend our money matters. I think I'm preaching to the choir there. And so as a company, where are we spending our considerable resources, and what impact is that spending having? And also reputation enhancement and reputation enhancement and protection, not projection, although that could be that too. Before I go there, I want to say that it's really hard to find hard numbers as far as return on investment for having a code of conduct with your suppliers. What you can find out there are cases where the supply chain has gone wrong. Something is discovered in your supply chain. I think Apple had lots of big companies have had very public embarrassments and damage to their brands because of practices that were in their supply chain, such as forced labor or child labor. And so what I'm choosing to focus on for this discussion here is, per the UN, there are 168 million children around the world that are working rather than going to school. And by working, we mean they are in labor-type situations that aren't necessarily getting paid. 45.8 million people are enslaved. That was kind of a shocking number to me. Modern slavery looks different than historic slavery, but it still exists. A lot. How many of you have cotton somewhere in your supply chain or in your products? How many of us are wearing cotton? According to verite.org, these are the companies where either child labor, the little parentheses with CL means child labor, FL means forced labor. These are countries where either child labor or forced labor is used in the production of cotton. What are we supporting with the money that we spend? How many of you have tin cans somewhere in your products or in your incoming supplies? Any metal? These are the countries where coltan, tungsten, and tin are reported to be produced with child labor and or forced labor. We all have these materials in our cell phones too, by the way. Fish, does anyone have fish in their supply chain? In their pet treats or that kind of thing? These are the countries where forced labor or child labor is involved in fish procurement. Verite.org, if you want to dig into this, they have a really amazing website where it goes commodity by commodity basically and gives you some really deep information around labor practices around the world. It also provides tools and resources for doing something about it. So they don't just present this information and leave you feeling depressed because this is heavy stuff. There are things to do about it. So as you build a supplier code of conduct, typical practices that you will see, elements that you will see included in a code of conduct include agreements around business integrity, human rights, environmental management, social responsibility, communications and reporting, and also monitoring and consequences. What do you do if someone or a company in your supply chain violates one of the agreements of your code of conduct? Do you have a remediation period? Do you provide support? Rob talked about how Ben & Jerry's provides actual both monetary but also educational support to improve conditions in the supply chain. So that's an important component to consider as you move forward with a code of conduct as well. Just wanted to share a few examples. Eagle Protect is a B Corp. They provide disposable gloves. Does anyone use disposable gloves in their manufacturing? And see a number of hands there. Well, there's a B Corp that makes sustainable disposable gloves. And their supplier code of conduct goes deep, and it's very thorough, and it's many pages long, and it's available online. And it talks about that the conditions that they set with their supply chain apply to the whole supply chain, including sub-suppliers, subcontractors, and farms. And standards equally apply to permanent, temporary, night, legal young workers, salaried workers, hourly paid, etc. It's a really wonderful example of a very almost intimidatingly thorough code of conduct. And just some run-of-the-mill companies out there and different ways that they're using their code of conduct to promote their transparency. eBay has a code of conduct on their website. Hershey's does as well, and you can do all kinds of things with branding and that kind of thing when you, if you choose to share your code of conduct in your transparency efforts. So how do you move the needle? How do you start to create a supplier code of conduct? That will be talked about by Melissa in the action planning segment of this workshop. And so I think we might turn to questions, or we're just going to go straight to Melissa. I'm not sure which way Caitlin wants to run this, but our next steps include learning about the tools that the Pet Sustainability Coalition has available to you around each of these 3 metrics, and whether you choose the metric of improving employee engagement and satisfaction, or you want to start working on increasing diversity in your leadership teams, or you want to work on a supplier code of conduct, you'll be able to divide up and use an action planning tool to take home with you and start to make a difference, because just starting is important. Thank you.